Everybody see my screen?
Yes.
I can.
All right, good deal. So good evening, everybody, and thanks for having me. I'm Kyle Shepard. I'm the Director of Public Relations and Outreach for Banding Coalition of the Americas. We're a volunteer-operated nonprofit that purely focuses on avian research and educational outreach. So we band all manner of different species from hawks and owls to hummingbirds, but today we're going to be focusing on a martin that we put a geo on at Brad's colony in Albertville that made it all the way to Brazil and back. Oh, is it going to let me do this? There we go. All right, so our Southeastern Purple Martin project all started with an inquiry from Brad. Basically, he sent me a message and said, do you or any banders that you know, would y'all be willing to come up and band my martins? And we get this sort of question a lot. And typically the answer is no, because we like our banding to go towards a larger project and pool of research to better understand birds as a whole and use that research to contribute to the whole of science. But basically, I told Brad that I would get back with him and my partner in crime, Emma Rhodes, who's also in here, and I started doing some research only to find this big black hole of Purple Martin research in the Southeast. So we started building this project based on questions that we had and questions that Brad had, and we sort of built this project with a lot of input from you guys here at Purple Martin Fanatics. So I want to thank you all for that, and a lot of expertise to go along with it. So Brad, do you want to chime in here and just give a little bit of background on your colony and why you reached out to us? Because this is how all of it started. You're muted.
I didn't mute. Somebody muted me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I've wanted to have my birds banded ever since I started, and I started in 2003. Reached out to Bob Sargent, who many of you won't know who that is. He was a very well-known bander in the state of Alabama, and he primarily worked at Dauphin Island, I think, and maybe Fort Morgan, and hummingbirds were his passion. So his exact response was, nobody cares about Purple Martins, when I asked him about banding mine. So, but I've seen birds colonies being banded for years, and geolocator work. And at the time, when I contacted Kyle, I had no idea geolocators were even on the map. So that was a nice surprise. But I just always wanted to know the travel route for the birds. There's, as Kyle said, there's a lot of information from Texas and areas there, and up north in Pennsylvania. There's been a lot of banding studies done and geolocator studies, but as he said, we're in a black hole down here. Very little information about migration routes, so we can only make assumptions. So with my background in science, I just always thought it would be interesting to be able to know more about it, and fortunately Kyle and Emma were willing to do that. So
yeah, so we started building this project. Brad, I think one of your questions was wanting to know if the martins that were returning were using the same gourds as well, which we'll be able to dive into a little more this year, because we're going to focus on banding more adults than we did last year. Right. But also starting out, the possibility of geolocators wasn't really on the docket. But once they started coming around, or we started warming up to the idea, we reached out to TJ Zenzel with USGS, who we've worked with before and have been decent friends with, and he agreed to help us on this study. So prior to this, we didn't have any expertise or knowledge or experience in putting geolocators on. So TJ brought that experience to us to help us deploy and train us how to put the geolocators on. And as far as the project overview goes, our goals were pretty simple, although it took a lot of work to accomplish just these simple goals. So we wanted to better understand the status of purple martins in the southeast, track some natal dispersal and return rates, and discover what migration routes these birds are taking, like Brad said. Last year, we banded around 600 martins across 4 colonies in 3 different states, so Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And this year, we're on track to band somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 martins between 7 colonies in those 3 states. The vast majority of these will be nestlings, just because it's easier to band nestlings and doesn't take nearly as much time and effort as it does to catch and band adults, and especially deploy geos. It's not letting me change again. Hang on.
Outfitting the birds with geos was definitely an experience. I know it was something that I would have never thought we would have tied on backpack straps to a geolocator and sent them on their merry way, but that's exactly what y'all did.
Yeah, and I'll get into a little more of that in a few slides. But just a quick recap of what bird banding is. So it's a federally regulated form of research. So Emma and I are both federally and state licensed to be able to do this work. So all of the data that we collect gets reported to the bird banding lab, which is the people who regulate us, issue us our permits, give us our federal bands that you can see on this martin's right leg. The color bands on like the one on the left, we actually make ourselves. But after all that data is pushed to the banding lab, they store it like a big clearinghouse of all banding data through the US and Canada. Also, the banding lab, as part of being a regulatory entity, makes sure that any projects that banders do across North America are contributing to the good of science. So you can't just become a bander and then band just your backyard birds, because that's not really contributing to anything. So that's part of the reason why we put together this project. We submitted a project proposal. We also had to request certain permissions for color bands and for geolocators, and that they allowed us to start this project. But one thing to note, that color bands and tags are permitted per county, so they're not statewide, like most of our banding permissions are.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty stuff. Last year, we deployed 22 MK series geolocators from Lowtech. They're a company out of Canada. Well, they have an office in Canada. I think originally they're from the UK. And it's a pretty simple device that does only 2 things. It collects a light level reading every 2 minutes and correlates that with a timestamp. So from the time it's turned on, it'll collect data for roughly 365 days before the battery dies. They are attached like a backpack with a leg loop harness made out of Teflon, or like braided Teflon cord. So in the event that we don't actually retrieve a geolocator off a martin, maybe it goes to a different colony, the Teflon does break down over time and it will eventually fall off, so that bird doesn't have to carry that geolocator for the rest of its life. There are a lot of limitations with geolocators. They're not pinpoint by any means. They're not GPS. So they're just generalized locations, and all the data is stored on board. So if we don't get the geolocator back, we don't get any of the data back, which is a huge crux. But even with GPS trackers that they have out now, like the ones that PMCA are using, they're also stored on board. So again, if you don't get it back, you don't get any data. But for this particular bird, whenever it returned to Brad's colony, Brad spent a lot of time narrowing down which gourd he preferred and which gourd he stuck to. And after that, Emma and I made a quick road trip up to see Brad and recapture this bird, which was a pretty scientific way to do it. I think we stuck a Swiffer on a pole, and as soon as he went in the gourd, we blocked the entrance, pulled the rack down, pulled the bird. And I still have that Swiffer on a stick in the bed of my truck in case I need to go get another But once we had the bird in hand, we removed the geolocator. We took blood. There it is. Brad's got a Swiffer on a stick. Yeah, so once we had the bird in hand, we took the geolocator off. We took blood and feather samples for future DNA analysis and released them back into the colony. By that time, it was getting pretty dark, but Emma and I stayed overnight and watched the colony early that morning, and he had returned to his mate in the gourd that we had pulled him out of later that evening. So even after all that, he decided to stick around. So once we got home, I got to work retrieving the data off of the geolocator. And it's all the data is stored in hexadecimal code, which if you're not a coder is incredibly confusing and doesn't mean anything. And it was confusing to me and didn't mean anything to me until a few weeks ago when I was trying to figure all this out. But basically, this hexadecimal code needs to be decompressed into a very long list of light levels and their correlated timestamps. So this is just a screenshot of what we're working with. So this is a coding program called R. It allows us to take this decompressed data and filter it out, shimmy all of these data points down to what we need. So once it was decompressed, it took us several weeks of transforming this data into something that we could actually understand. During the 280 days that this geo was deployed, it collected 202,279 data points.
That's incredible.
And all of those data points had to be scrubbed and whittled down to the most important points, which are just twilight time. So sunrise and sunset for each day that geolocator was out there. Then we have to correlate a very small portion of this data set to a known location. So the known location would be Brad's colony. So the latitude and longitude of Brad's colony. And we made a little bit of a guesstimation on how long that bird stayed there after deployment. And then from that correlation, we can extrapolate a general latitude longitude for the rest of the year based on sunrise and sunset times. It's by no means an exact science, but it gives us a general look at where this bird went. So this was one of the first graphs that R gives you as you're crunching this main data. This represents the entire data set, and the black areas being nighttime, and then white areas being daylight time. The orange lines represent the expected sunrise and sunset for the location of Brad's colony through this time frame. So I found a geolocator stepped into the dirt under one of Brad's gourd racks earlier this spring when we were up catching this bird. And I was really hopeful that it came off the Martin whenever it got back, but unfortunately it did not. So this graph gives us a really easy way to tell whether or not the geo traveled. On the one that we found in the dirt, the black blob area representing nighttime matched these orange lines exactly. So it didn't go anywhere. All right, so this is where things get a little cool and a little tricky. So after scrubbing all of that data, we had to go through every single day of data and identify true twilight time. So what specific point was sunrise and what specific point was sunset, and whittled all of those 202,000 some odd data points down to 560. And all of those data points are represented on the map to the right of your screen. After mapping all these, you can tell the geolocator data is extremely messy. So all of this has to be taken with some measure of caution and a really big grain of salt. But from this, we have to merge our knowledge of bird migration with this data to get an educated guess on the most likely route taken by this bird. So in this particular case, this bird took a counterclockwise route, which I'll show in a little more detail later on in this presentation. But in this specific map, it's important to know that the period around the equinox, represented by the blue lines, is incredibly unreliable data and should almost be dismissed completely. In places along the Central America route where we have rather large north-south jumps, it's an indication of fairly rapid east-west movement. So we sort of assert that the true route taken by this martin was an average of all of these points. To make things slightly more understandable, we have this map that groups nearby data points into a certain area. The larger the circle, the more data points exist in that area and the more time the bird spent there. So the dots are also numbered in chronological order. So 1 and I believe 14 are under that number 2 blob where Brad's colony is. But one thing that's really important to mention about this one is that this map is subject to all inconsistencies and potentially unreliable data from the previous map. So the dots labeled 6 and 7, in my opinion, should be thrown out because that was from the subset right around the equinox. So I left it in here because this is what the data shows, but just in my personal opinion, it should be viewed as an error and, well, meaning that the bird didn't go all the way south into northern Argentina before it went back to the northern coast. So here's where all the fun stuff starts. And this is what everybody wants to see and sort of, I guess, the fruits of several weeks of labor jumping through all of the data and crunching the numbers. So starting up top in the Albertville, Alabama box, we deployed that geolocator on June 9th, and the birds either stayed at the colony or at a nearby roost until June 26th. And after that, it left and made a one-day jump into Western Louisiana or East Texas, but it looks more like Western Louisiana, and stayed there for a grand total of 33 days before making an overnight jump to the Yucatan Peninsula. From there, it spent about 10 days in the Yucatan, I guess, doing what there is to do in Mexico. And around August 12th, he had already started moving south and was moving through Honduras and Nicaragua. And by the 15th, he was moving through Panama and got into Colombia around the 16th. We jump ahead just a bit to the span of time between August 22nd and October 5th, where he spent a good chunk of time somewhere in the Amazon rainforest. And then from here, he moved to his main wintering grounds where he stayed the longest period of time east of the rainforests. So that area between October 11th and February 7th is where he spent the vast majority of his time. And then on February 8th, he started moving out of that area back to the northwest, and then made a pretty slow jog over the course of, I think, 23 days back towards Venezuela, and then jumped from the Venezuelan coast, spent March 4th and 5th in Cuba, and then jumped again to the tip of Florida and followed land all the way back to Brad's colony. So again, all of this needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but this is, I believe, the most likely route for this bird. The fall migration time that it took him to get from the colony to his main wintering grounds took 108 days. For the spring movement, it took 28 days from the time he left his main wintering grounds and got back to Albertville. But just the jump from the Venezuelan coast back to the colony only took 5 days. So he made a really, really quick jump on the way back. That's probably driven by breeding pressures, trying to get back so he knows he has a gourd and can find a mate early. And for some of you folks who have been in the Purple Martin world way longer than I have, can probably answer that question with with more certainty than I can. But that sort of wraps up Brad's bird, but I added in a small chunk of Lynn's bird in here too. I think Lynn is still in here. We recaptured one of the geolocators birds that we released in her colony, but I haven't quite gotten everything done the way I have for Brad's bird yet. So it's still in the works, and this is just sort of a sneak peek. I got a phone call and some pictures from Lynn, and she said, "Hey, I've got a geo bird." I called Emma, and Emma dropped everything she was doing and ran to Georgia so she could get this bird when she was supposed to be on her way down here in preparations for another banding demo. But this is just the general raw data from Lynn's bird, and it is incredibly messy compared to Brad's bird, especially on the spring route back. There was just a lot of haze in the data. Sunrise and sunset times weren't very clear. I don't know if the bird was flying through massive rainstorms or had a lot of cloud cover or were moving through trees for whatever reason. But the ending part of the journey is really just a big question mark for this bird. Along with that, I built this Google map, which I think I think everybody has seen, and this may not be true to what this bird did. And I'll just say that out front. There is a very good possibility that instead of leaving Venezuela and jumping straight to Cuba, instead it took the route of the Lesser Antilles, basically island hopping the entire way to Cuba until it jumped to Florida and then followed land all the way back to her colony. But that is, in a nutshell, everything I have. I've got another geolocator inbound from Brad. I think you did mail that, right?
You better.
That means no.
I didn't get it. I didn't get it in the mail today. It's still in my truck. I promise. I'll get it before the week's over. Promise.
All right, do it before the battery dies.
Pinky swear.
But we also have another inbound geolocator from Lynn. So there will be more geolocator news to come. But that basically brings me to the end of everything that I've got so far. So if y'all have any questions about anything that I've gone over so far that you can't answer and maybe I can help, you can take a photo of the screen, send me an email, do whatever. If you want to see any of the other projects that we're into, our website's a great place to go. Our Facebook is a great place to go. But if anybody has questions about how we put geolocators on or anything that I've gone over so far, now would be a good time to do that.
I'm trying to see how to raise my hand.
Oh,
But since nobody's talking, I'll go ahead and I'll just go ahead and ask.
Go ahead,
where
Debbie.
is Lynn's colony?
Lynn's colony
Where
is
is
in
Lynn?
Fort Valley, Georgia.
Okay. That's up near Atlanta?
No, I'm right in
It's-
the middle of the state.
Yeah, it's just east of Columbus.
Oh, okay.
Hey, this is Alton Punt. Hey, what was the battery life that was left on Brad's Geo when it came back?
So that's a good question. It won't give us that data. So it's just sort of arbitrary, and it can fluctuate with manufacturing specs. Whenever we get them, it is encouraged that we put them on a bird immediately, but we don't have that luxury because we're putting on another 78 geolocators this year in 4 different colonies. So we had to order them early to get them here, but once we get them in the mail, we have to stick them in the fridge and keep them in a cold, dark place to help preserve that battery life as best we can. It does give us a metric for how much memory was used by the data collected, and it was only like 4%. So the battery life data is, the battery life is the biggest.
Oh, the memory, I didn't even think about asking that, but only 4% of the total memory was used?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I'm gonna quit
And
sharing
that's
my
with
screen again. Hopefully it'll lock it up.
227,000.
So with all the work, Kyle, that you put in the first couple of weeks, doing the first couple birds, are the rest going to be easier?
Sorry, say that one more time.
With all the work that you put into checking out the first couple birds that came back, are all the birds after this going to be a lot easier to do, or is it still going to be very difficult and time consuming to get the data?
So the subsequent ones have been substantially easier because we have the framework of the coding done. We do have to alter the code for each of the geos, and for each data set, we have to go through and specify the exact sunrise and sunset time per day that each geo was out. So if I had a geo in hand from the time that I downloaded the data and I worked straight through, it would probably take me about 8 hours to get a workable map.
That's a lot quicker than it was on the first one, though.
Correct. The first one took like 3 weeks.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, I was patient. I never said, "Hey, Kyle, hey, Kyle, hey, Kyle." Well, maybe 2 or 3 times a day. But
Yeah. You know, you did that a lot. Also, I should mention about Brad's bird, just straight line distances, not taking into account any just daytime flight around his wintering grounds. Just migration route, that bird flew in excess of 9,500 miles. So
holy
that's a whole lot of
smokes.
sky miles to be packing on, but these birds are definitely built for it.
Kyle,
Yes.
by some odd chance, did you happen to cross-reference the migration path with at any time there might have been a hurricane or anything significant in the ocean that would have made a difference for like how many days they spent someplace and then they would cover a vast majority of area within a day or two?
I have not done that yet. That is on the list, especially for South American storm systems, to see if he may have been encouraged by weather to move around a little bit more. And I should check on the weather for the migration route back. Although from other species that we band and study, the migration back is normally way faster than the southern migration. So I guess I just sort of accepted that up front, but you're right. I shouldn't. I should do all the weather looking too.
I was just wondering if that made much of a difference. Of course, you know, with especially a hurricane.
Yeah, so there was also the question of why we chose geolocators instead of like GPS tags or MODIS tags. And for any of you who's not familiar with MODIS, it is a global collaboration that was started by Birds Canada that uses radio telemetry. So there's a radio tag with an antenna put on a bird, and as it's flying along its migration route, as long as it passes within a certain range of a MODIS tower, so a receiver station, it'll ping and we can sort of read bird routes by that. But the limiting factor there is it has to pass a tower. So if we were to use MODIS tags, we would miss the entire transit across the Gulf of Mexico. South America is getting more and more MODIS towers as we speak. But for locations like fairly deep inside the Amazon rainforest, I imagine it's going to be a very long time, if possible at all, to get MODIS in there. I did reach out to Joe Segrist, who's the head of the Purple Martin Conservation Association, shared all of this data with him just to get his thoughts. And I got a line on some really good GPS trackers that they are now using for their martins. And I wish that I had had that data prior to ordering 78 more geolocators. But it is what it is at this point. We know that we're getting some back and that we're getting some decent data. So in future years, as long as time allows and Emma's still around and hasn't been swept off to a super cool postdoc somewhere, then we can look at at doing some GPS work instead of just geolocator generalization.
You
I-
can grab us a ground sweat too. We can come back.
Hey, also
Emma,
one
you broke
thing
up.
too.
I didn't hear a word you said.
Also, one thing to keep in mind too, beside looking at the weather patterns of them going south and heading north, the farmers in South America and Central America also burn down the trees. And I wonder, and we get a lot of that plume smoke in March and April here in Texas. And I wonder how much of that fire smoke pushes that bird north.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we run into that with other species that we study too. Western species of hummingbirds in particular, a few of each species will make their way to the southeast to winter instead of pushing into Mexico. So on their way back, any wildfires through California or even into Alaska, where rufous hummingbirds nest, have got to play some sort of role in how they shift geographically throughout the year. So that's a good idea. I'll have to look into that too. Y'all got me making all kinds of notes.
How many
Which is
birds
good.
are currently have geolocators that you'd be tracking? Like currently, how many do you know have them?
So we put on 22.
Yeah.
And I think we have
Well, five.
we've accounted for 6.
Oh,
One
okay.
geolocator bird returned to Brad's colony without his geo, so he lost it somewhere along the way, and it was not the geolocator that I found in the dirt. So the harness may have just been a little too loose, and he shrugged it off somewhere. And this has been there's been a pretty big learning curve, especially through this first season. And Bill and John Barrow, John, are you in here? I think you are. I think y'all have a lot of experience with getting geolocators or other trackers on these birds and making sure that these harnesses are tight enough to where they don't come off, but loose enough to where they don't start hurting the birds is a fine balance.
But you currently you've placed 22 in 22 different birds so far.
Yes. Yep.
I have-
So this year we've got another 78 to put on birds. So
wow.
for each of the 4 colonies, each colony will have 25 geolocators representing their birds. So we've also added Bob and Barbara Zittle's colony in Venice, Florida, just to band. We've added Debbie's colony just to band as well. And I think that covers everybody. But one thing we ran into last year, sorry, I'm reading comments. One thing we ran into last year was we didn't get our geolocators soon enough to be able to put any of them out in our Holt, Florida colony, which is in the Panhandle just east of Pensacola. So we ran out of time there. So they're going to get all 25 of their geos this year. And we'll have to break that up into a couple of different days just so we don't take forever first thing in the morning to get geolocators on these birds.
Hey, I saw Jason Beams raise his hand. Jason, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to, out of all these birds that you've gotten back so far and got an accurate track on, does it look like most of them all fly the same path, or have you noticed them going different ways?
Well, with a subset of 2, both of these birds took generally the same route. Although Brad's bird, whenever it left his colony, ended up in western Louisiana, Lynn's bird left the Gulf Coast around Apalachicola, Florida, which is near St. George Island. But the return route was similar. And neither of those birds took the same route in the fall as in the spring as they did in the fall. So I don't know if that is a regional thing yet, the more geos we get back and the more crunching I do, maybe I can answer that question. I did pose that question to Joe Segrist with PMCA, and he said it's not super common, but it's not rare for these birds to go fall one way and then spring a different route.
Well, the reason I was asking, you see all these videos of them down in Texas where they all accumulate. It's like they all get together to make the flight. I was just wondering if it was as accurate that they all stay together.
No.
Yeah, so to an extent, these big roosts will have groups of martins move all at the same time. We expected for at least one of these martins, and hopefully one of these martins do use the Mobile Bay corridor to make their way south. So past Fort Morgan, past Dauphin Island, across the Gulf, but so far neither of them have done that. But from our observations, and Emma can chime in on this too, during late summer, early fall, there will just be thousands and thousands of martins circling above the Fort Morgan Peninsula, and then they'll all move offshore at once together. And where they go from there, I just assume is hitting the can.
Yeah,
Where are
the
you
general,
talking about the Fort Morgan Peninsula? Is that for Florida?
Alabama.
So if you're looking at the state of Alabama and you got that little chunk that juts down towards the Gulf, Mobile Bay splits that in half.
Oh,
So
okay.
Dauphin Island is the western barrier island for Alabama, and Fort Morgan is the eastern side of Mobile Bay.
But it looked like Brad's went to the Lake Pontchartrain roost, probably, right? In West
Yes.
Louisiana, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
so a
Yes.
lot of stopover
Barbara?
sites, are in migratory birds are learned things. So generally when a bird first migrates, it only has an instinct of the general direction and distance that it's going. And so, many of these birds that are stopping in Louisiana, they just probably were going in that general direction, and they found that spot, and that it has a high abundance of insects, would be my guess. And then that's why it's continuing to use it now that it's found it. So that could explain. So for instance, why Lynn's bird didn't stop at that stopover site like Brad's. And as some people pointed out, weather can have an impact on stopover period of birds. Again, generally that's not going to throw them completely off of their track, but yes, they will stop at stopover locations and rest longer if the weather is not conducive for flying across the Gulf.
Sure. Barbara Zittel, you had a question?
Yes, Kyle, I'm assuming that there's hundreds of birds that have geolocators in them between the United States and Canada. Is there a way from maybe the PMCA to organize data crunchers to come up with a program that could do it in less than 8 hours?
Yes. So part of the reason that it takes me so long is because I'm new to this. So as I do this more often, it will just get faster. But Eva and I are very much babies in this journey. So we're sort of figuring it out as we go, and our code in R is getting better every time that we do it.
But wouldn't it be nice to have a data analysis?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Kyle.
Wouldn't it be nice to have a data analysis program?
Well, yeah. So, I'm sure at this point that there are machine learning things that, so you would either have to, because again, Kyle was saying there's some manual parts of the code where you're making judgment calls. And you can't get rid of that with pure coding and program unless you have a machine learning application. And that's beyond me and Kyle. Obviously, I will add, like Kyle said, it kind of has taken more time too, because to sort of speed up the process, Kyle and I tag teamed the data, and I that kind of slowed things down a little bit, just because Kyle is learning as well as myself. We're learning geolocator data, and I have experience in R. Kyle doesn't. So this was sort of a learning period too for both of us, and for Kyle to learn R. So yeah, I'm sure we'll get faster. But yes, you would have to probably pay someone, or we would have to collaborate and maybe come up with some sort of deal in most cases to get someone to write something to that caliber. Because again, someone could write something with automatic code with loops, but if you're going to get rid of all that manual editing, it has to be machine learning, would be my guess.
Yes. So to add on to that, when I was talking about the portion where we have to go through each day of the data collected, and in some cases manually select the sunrise and sunset period, part of the issue and generalization of this data is a human perspective. So our code will pick out what it thinks sunrise and sunset is, and sometimes the data is too messy for that program to get it right, and then we have to go through and throw out everything that is not true. So one thing that Emma and I have done is worked with these data sets separately, and we each have our own bias. So inevitably we don't pick the same sunset and sunrise time as each other, because we're not doing the exact same thing or using the exact same edited data set. But each of us going through with our own biases, we ended up with the same general track. But it does take some human element to go through there and figure all this stuff out. Courtney, I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Have you thought about putting geolocators out with your birds?
I have, and I would love to do that, but our museum scientist is swamped with other projects this year, so it's probably just not going to happen this year.
I am very familiar with being swamped with projects. It can take a lot of time and a lot of effort. In fact, the 29th of this month, so in 18 days, I'm going to be heading to Venice to band with Barbara and Bob, and basically the entire month after that, I will be bouncing around all of the other colonies, getting all of these birds banded. So thank God I work for myself.
There's, I guess, a little bit of a dark side to this project that I need to discuss with everybody. I mean, I don't need to, but I think you need to know. This is a very cool project. I mean, it's been mind-boggling to be involved with it. However, if you have starling-resistant entrance holes on your gourds and you want to participate in a geolocator study, you have to modify the entrances to enlarge them. Now, I'm not plugging anybody's gourd. I buy mine just like y'all buy yours. I don't have any endorsements from anybody, obviously, but the Troyer gourds are easy to modify. You have to make a keyhole in the top of the entrance to allow for the extra room for the geolocator, and that's easily fixed by doing the Lewis modification to the gourd when you're finished. Also, for those who are participating next year that didn't participate this year, one thing that I should have done that I did not do was follow some advice from John Barrow, which was not to hang all of my modified gourds to start with. I didn't modify. I still have 11 geolocators that are unaccounted for. I have a female that arrived 2 weeks ago that I still have not been able to catch that has one on her. As Kyle said, I've got one that came back that didn't have a geo, and then we found a geo on the ground. So my colony is basically full. It's not full, but statistically speaking, it's full enough that it would be very hard for a new martin to find a modified gourd to get in. The modified entrances are easier for them to enter, so they were some of the first gourds chosen. So if you're participating in this program next year, as I know some of you are, I would highly suggest not hanging all your gourds to start with, or either my suggestion to Tiffany Anderson was to go ahead and do the modifications, install the Lewis mod or the starling stoppers, and then as you see geolocator birds come back, remove those wing entrapment or starling stoppers so they can actually enter the gourds, and you've got an empty gourd for them to go in, because I shot myself in the foot by not doing that. So I wanted everybody that might do it in the future to know that going forward.
Yeah, so that was a big issue. And there are issues with pretty much every martin colony that Emma and I have had the privilege of dealing with. And for those of you in here who are a part, thanks. I know that this can be a headache, because the moment that you put a keyhole in the top of that gourd, for whatever reason, a starling can get in there.
They can smell it,
It's
I
not
swear.
much. We're talking an eighth to a quarter inch, and that's enough for a starling to get in there. So it has caused some substantial headaches, and unfortunately, it seems to be a necessary evil of doing geolocator work, because I don't know that it is worth attempting to hang round hole gourds, especially for somebody like Brad, who has thousands of starlings fly past his yard every day. But also, as a part of this project, any of the gourds that I personally modified, we're going to go through and buy and repair all of those holes with Lumods too. So in the future, that won't be much of a problem.
So I have a question.
Yep.
Do MODIS tagged birds or GPS tagged birds also require the same modifications to the gourds that the geotag birds do?
It depends on what company you get them from. So MODIS tag birds, if you get the hybrid life tag from Cellular Tracking Text, CTT, I don't believe those need to be modified because they sit almost flush with the bird. One thing that can help tremendously is when putting the geolocator on is to take the feathers, the end closest to the the end of the geolocator closest to the head. If you scoop out some of those feathers and lay them on top, it'll sit a little bit closer to the body, and that can help. As far as GPS tags, I don't know the answer to that, but I could find out for you pretty quick.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The whole reason I said what I said, I don't know if any of you have had me on your screen, and I've got like 4 or 5 of you up top, but I've jumped up and disappeared 20 times during the presentation. I've left my headphones on so I could hear, but I've been trying to shoot a starling off my gourd rack, and every time I get up, it flies off. So it's I might have missed it one time. I don't know.
I figured something like that was up.
It was.
I'm really excited about. I'm super excited about having some banded this year. Where are you going to do the geolocators? You've got 78, so are those going to be split among 3 or 4 colonies, or how are you?
Yes.
determining?
So we put Brad, we put 16 geos out in your
16, 16, yes.
Yeah, so we'll add another 9 to Brad's
last
colony.
year?
Yes.
Yeah, we put 16 out in Brad's colony last year. And part of that was because of the age of his colony. whenever we got geos coordinated. He just ended up having the most ASY birds that had nestlings of an appropriate age to geo. So if you put, we learned this from John Barrow. He's been incredibly helpful through this entire project, and really an asset for us, because we would have learned a lot of hard lessons had we not heard from him. But if you put a geolocator on a bird that just has eggs and they have not hatched, there's a very high likelihood that they will abandon the colony completely. But if they have young in the gourd when they're geoed, there's a better chance of them hanging around. To the modified gourd instance, we did not initially know that not cutting a keyhole in the gourd would be a problem. Brad discovered that 2 days later when he noticed that one of the geoed birds was trying to get into the geo and couldn't. And then, of course, we all freaked out. So if a bird can't get back into the geo, they can't feed their young, and everything dies. Which also led us to more learning opportunities. So this year we are only doing one parent per nest, and modifying all of the gourds that are being used by geobirds. So in the case that a modified gourd isn't modified quite enough for the bird to get in there and it goes unnoticed for a couple days, at least there's one parent able to feed young.
Well, I don't have much starling, or I haven't had much sparrows this year, very many sparrows this year either. I've caught one starling, and I just haven't seen any. I did a nest check today, and I've got lots more eggs than last time, and it looks like just about every one of my gourds are going to be used.
That's excellent.
I may not, but I went from 18 last year to 56 this year, and every single one of them has the nests are wallowed out. They've got leaves in them. I had eggs in one gourd last Tuesday what's today? Thursday when I checked, and then today I have them in 10 gourds. So they're getting down to business right now.
So how many birds
I hope
were
I had a
tagged?
good year.
Sorry. How many bags?
I didn't have any tagged last year.
No, but how many birds were tagged at Lynn's place last year?
6, and we've gotten 2 back.
That's a pretty good rate of return, Lynn.
It's very good.
The interesting thing about the bird that we just caught yesterday is that gourd wound up with a starling in it. I never had a starling problem until we modified the gourds, and this year, of course, I started having a starling problem. And I've got one of those traps that goes in your gourd. So I saw him go in the gourd, and it was, of course, on the back side from my house. So I went out there and let the rat down, looked in there, and he had it filled with stuff. I pulled about half of the stuff out and put that trap in there, and then caught him about an hour or so later. And of course, and dispatched him and all that. So anyway, and then it was, I guess it's been about a week or so, and I was out there with the binoculars and I saw that bird with the tag, and felt like, because my problem is my regular tags are like a gold color, and then that geo tag is supposedly orange, which I think is just more of a brassy gold.
Right.
Yeah,
so it is very hard. Yeah. Somebody took somebody that has terrible eyesight and gave them like the worst colors to try to distinguish. So I'm out there. I've already caught one bird that we thought had a geo on him, but of course he was just a tagged bird. He was not. But anyway, but yeah, so it was interesting that gourd actually had a starling in it that had built a big nest, and I got him out and dispatched him, and then the geo bird turned in. But I did the same thing that Brad did when I first had a few birds and I knew none of those had geos on them or anything. I had closed up the gourds that Kyle had modified and just had a couple of them that I could watch toward my house, starlings, and then all the rest of them still had just the regular crescent starling resistant holes, because I swear it was the next morning after Kyle left and those daggum things were out there on my gourd rack, and I had never even seen them out there on there. So I was freaking out. But anyway, between the trap and the gun and the air rifle and stuff, we're taking care of them. And I actually haven't seen any in several days.
Cool.
Well, Kyle wasn't joking when he talked about thousands of starlings flying by my colony. When we were watching for the geo bird, there would be flocks of 50 and 100 flying around everywhere. So if I can do geolocators at my colony, I think most anybody can do geolocators at theirs. It just takes more time of, watching and trapping and shooting, and it just takes more time.
I don't shoot. Mike does. Mike shot several of them for me. But like I said, if I can figure out which gourd they're going in and I can put that trap door in there, then I can catch them. Because if I can catch them, I can get rid of them. I just can't.
Yeah.
I just don't. I can't shoot them. I don't trust my shooting enough. He popped a hole in my gourd or something.
So speaking of birds entering gourds, I do have sort of an off-topic question for all of you longtime landlords. Our Holt, Florida colony, who did not get any geos last year, had a really successful year, but this year they're not doing so hot because their colony is constantly getting hawked by a merlin. So for those of you who don't know what a merlin is, it's a falcon. It winters down here and should be leaving any day now, I hope. But it seems to be putting a whole lot of pressure on that colony. And I'm wondering, for those of you who have had relentless Cooper's hawk attacks, does that affect your yearly output of young martins?
No.
So, no. I usually experience a Sharpie here in the spring every year, and she can literally snatch them out of the air. But usually she moves on after 4 or 5 weeks. But it's up to the landlord. It's a constant watch that the landlords have to do. So there are several things they can do, though, to help. And we talk about this a lot on the Fanatics. Courtney and Brad know I'm getting ready to go into my spiel.
Here comes the air horn.
The air horn is a tool. Trimming trimming branches off of trees. If they can't cut down the trees, trim the branches up. But the biggest thing that has helped my colony, besides trimming the branches up on some of my trees are 150 feet away, but that Sharpie is just persistent. Even 150 feet away, she would manage to run them down in the field. But setting up bird feeding stations in a perimeter around your colony draws in blackbirds, grackles, doves, cardinals, every kind of bird feeder bird that you can imagine will come to that bird feeder. And they tend to be a lot more wary and watch for the hawks than purple martins do. So bird feeding stations and a lot of decoys. I have 14 purple martin decoys and I've got 4 dove decoys that I set out during the year. 1 or 2 decoys just doesn't cut it. You got to put out a lot of decoys and put them on those ground stakes. If you put them on the ground stakes, you can zip tie a ground stake to your gourd racks or a nearby fence post or whatever and move them around a lot. Those types of things can really help a colony that's in dire straits.
Okay, thanks for that. The Holt colony is sort of a different animal than the other colonies that are a part of this project. It's actually hosted by the Florida Wildlife Commission and on the Blackwater Reserve east
Oh.
of Pensacola. So
Yeah.
it complicates things a little bit.
That does.
The entire time that I've been there and the decade or so time frame that they've had their colony up, they have thankfully never dealt with and still are not dealing with house sparrows or starlings.
Wow.
However, the current Merlin has been there for going on 3 months and is
Wow.
just treating it as a buffet. So
Yikes.
the Blackwater area that they are at is a hatchery or several different species of fish that they then release after they get to a certain size. So it's good habitat for martins. It's a lot of open area, but probably 100 feet away, there is a power line that runs through next to a dirt road. And then even further than that, there are a few really tall pine trees. So the only thing that has worked for them so far is for them to go out there and yell at it and fling their arms around in the air like a crazy person. But they can be off doing control burns. They can be working on other projects. They don't have the opportunity to really watch the colony as much as most of you do.
How big is the colony?
I believe it's 48 gourds.
Oh, wow.
And it's full every year.
I
So
bet.
they could definitely add more gourds and it would fill, in my opinion. It's just they're so busy, it's hard for them to add anything else on.
As early in the season as it is, and that Merlin being there, it's obviously only taking adult martins. So
Right. That's sad.
yes, it will affect the amount of nestlings produced by that colony.
Yeah.
And maybe they can rebound with SYs. Their adult migration in the panhandle of Florida should be very close to being wrapped up. They may still get a few more ASY birds, but they should already be getting SYs. So it could have an impact on, just because they not going to have as many adults there to lay eggs. The majority of my hawk issues come during fledgling time, like most colonies experience, and they get some, but they don't get that many until you get one that is really specialized at catching them.
Yeah.
So.
Are the attacks happening at the Martin gourd rack itself, or further out in the air in the field?
No, at the gourd rack itself. So it'll come out of nowhere and snatch martins off the gourd rack. It'll catch them mid-flight, leaving gourds.
How good are the fabricators there? Because they can make like a 2x4 mesh wire that sets on top of the rack, and that'll kind of make an umbrella that the martin can fly through the wire, but the hawk or the merlin can't, and kind of have a protection at home.
That's a good point, Alton, because I have noticed here, my cage has helped with the hawks, even though my cage is intended to keep the great horned owl out. It also has helped with the hawks, especially if they try to attack late in the evening. When all the martins are coming in, the martins are able to get into the cage inside and get into their gourds before the hawk can even get near them. I have my cage spaced about 10 to 12 inches out from all the nearest gourd entrances. So that may slow her down too.
What's your mesh size?
2x4. But I cut every other vertical out sometimes to make a 4x4. But with the Merlin, they're pretty small, aren't they? Like the size of maybe a kestrel or a falcon?
Yes.
Yeah, so you'd want to keep them 2x4.
Okay.
But martins can enter and exit that.
All right, super helpful. Thanks. In fact, it's telling already that Merlin is having a pretty big impact, because as of Friday last week, that colony only has one nest with one egg in it. And they should be very far along at this point.
So is there any chance they would cut back any trees or set up any bird feeders around or put out decoys? Or
I could convince them on the decoys. I may be able to convince them with some bird feeders, but the upkeep of that would be spotty, I assume. So
it's a public
it's just going to
site.
have to, yes, the public can get there. It's just not a very often visited place.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been there a couple times, well, probably 5 or 6 times. My in-laws are not far from there, and it's not what we would think of as a public colony, Kathy. It's out in the middle of boondocks in the woods, out in the country, and basically out in the middle of nowhere. So.
Yeah.
Question,
Anyway,
Kyle,
yeah,
you were
I'm
talking.
just gonna have to. Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Go ahead, finish up if.
I was just gonna say I'm gonna have to put a really big note on that colony's data this year. Just Merlin attacks for 4 straight months, but it'll be rough.
Okay, you were talking about modifying the entrances. Barb and Bob are here from Venice on the call, and they don't have any starling issues down there. So we elected, we felt it would be best to go with round holes, and they put a new Gemini rack down there. And as far as I know, Barbara and Bob, you're not having any starling issues, is that correct?
We had 2 birds who were killed, probably from sparrows. We had Duke Snyder come in, and look, I saved the birds so that he could look at them. But that was one incident in 2 days, and we haven't had any further incidents. No one is trying to develop a nest in any of our 66 cavities.
In fact, Duke put up a sparrow trap and it didn't catch anything.
Okay. I was just going to say that that's an option if you don't have starlings around. If you're going to go with the GPS tags or geolocators.
That's a good idea. And I think John Barrow mentioned that as well when we were talking to him prior to actually getting geolocators out for this project. He had mentioned that the ones that he was dealing with had a light stalk on the back of them, and you could hear that light stalk clicking in and out of the gourd as they came through. So we elected not to go with a light stalk, with the potential of it not collecting as good a data, but it seems to have done just fine without light stock. I think that helps these birds get in and out without much problem, as long as the gourd entrances have been modified. But they'd be able to get through a round hole gourd, no problem.
I have 16 round hole gourds that I will be putting on my new rack that I still haven't finished. So hopefully any more geo birds will be able to get in. For those of you who might be interested, I don't know if you can't see that. I drew what the modified entrance looks like. It's very simple to do. On the newer Troyers that have the wing entrapment guard on the inside, you can modify one with a razor knife in about a minute. I figured that out last weekend. You just make a 1/4 inch tall slot which hits the bottom of the wing entrapment guard and make it about 1 inch wide, and the geobirds have absolutely no issues at all getting back in those gourds then.
Does that take the pinhole away?
No, it's below the hole for the Haskell trap.
Okay.
And it covers completely up with the starling stopper as well. So you're not.
Also, Lynn, what gourds do you have?
She's got excluder gourds, I think. If she's
Yeah.
still here.
Yes, I'm still
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
Okay, so on the excluder gourds, even with the modified keyhole, the wing entrapment preventer thing on the inside of the gourd is still intact. So it didn't mess with that at all.
Yeah, that's one thing, knock on wood, I've never had a problem with. You know, is wing entrapment with these gourds. So and one of the things I was gonna say too, even as Kyle said, he did a very small keyhole on the entrances, and the bird that we caught yesterday, when I was watching him earlier in the day, I told Kyle and them, I said, I think he's got a geo on him, because he actually struggled going in and out, even with that keyhole cut in there a little bit now. Whereas a lot of them, you know, dive and just don't even slow down going in there. He was kind of having to going in and coming out was causing him a little problem. So, of course, he was a very healthy bird too. A lot of insects, apparently.
Yeah, chunky bird.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of these adult birds also seem to vary at least a little bit in their actual physical size. I know through watching birds at Brad's colony, some of them will just slip right through that entrance without any problem, even unmodified. And then some stick their head in there, and then they got to give a little shimmy to get through that entrance. So I don't know if the rest of you experience that as well. But just thought it was interesting to note.
Does anybody else have anything for Kyle or Emma or Courtney
Emma's
or
gone.
Kathy? Emma's gone. Bye, Emma. Kyle, thank you very much for doing this presentation. Thank you very much for putting up with me and banding my martins. I know it's a joy, but this has been invaluable for me. It's just great information for all of us. We wouldn't be here if we didn't love Purple Martins. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And I guess that is a wrap. So y'all have a good evening.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Cal.
thanks for having me.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kyle. And thanks, Emma.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.